I'm sorry. I don't even know what to say. This is what we've been, with myself and other people in the accessibility community, this is what we've been advocating for so long.
This was gamer Steve Saylor's reaction when he first loaded up a new game called The Last of Us Part 2. Steve is no ordinary gamer. He's legally blind, with severely reduced vision, and since he was a kid he's had to sit right up against the screen to play the games he loves. But in recent years, major games developers like Ubisoft have shown a new willingness to incorporate accessibility into their products. The Last of Us Part 2 has been called the most accessible game ever, and Steve Saylor's reaction on encountering the overwhelming accessibility options was to burst into tears. For the first time in my entire life, he said, I was able to sit back on the couch and play the game without any barriers getting in the way. So if you produce online content of any kind, including learning content, and you're asking yourself how important are accessibility standards, well, to people who may have felt excluded all their lives, they're this important.
This is why I do what I do. This is why I work so hard to promote accessibility. This is why, because this is important.
Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning.
Learning is fun.
Knowledge is power. Knowledge. Education.
Thanks are due to Don Taylor for recommending our guest this time. I've wanted to cover accessibility in learning for some time, and Don pointed us towards an industry-leading expert on accessible learning content. Kate Fitzgerald, Head of FACT, tell us about her.
Fact. Susi Miller is founder and director of ELAR Hub Limited, the only provider of e-learning accessibility specialised services in the L&D industry. The company provides training, auditing services and consultancy on every aspect of e-learning accessibility for clients including Amazon, Thomson Reuters, London Stock Exchange Group and Government of Canada.
So, Jay Curtis, Head of Themes. What did we talk about?
You covered the prevalence of disabilities in working populations, which is much higher than people usually think. I mean, look at you, John, for instance. You're really quite deaf.
Sorry.
And you're old.
Okay.
You discussed accessibility for online learning content, of course, but also how accessible the Metaverse is liable to be. And it's not all bad news there at all.
As far as games companies are concerned, it's not purely altruism that drives them towards accessibility. More people than you might think suffer from disabilities of one kind and another. So as markets become saturated, accessibility keeps the numbers growing. And there's a similar logic to why inclusivity matters so much for learning. As another guest on the podcast, Lior Locker, said in her recent TED Talk, we have some pretty big problems to solve in the world right now. And to solve them, we need all the people, not just some of them. Susi Miller, welcome to the podcast. It's great to be able to access your huge knowledge and expertise on the subject of accessibility in learning. This is a topic I've been interested in for a number of years, not just in a theoretical regard either. Occasionally I've been brought up rather short as a content producer when it's been pointed out to me that a website or a resource I was responsible for was not accessible, and I've had to do something about it in a hurry. I'm sure a lot of people will have had this experience. And in the process I've had to tangle with applying accessibility guidelines to some pretty intractable formats like PDF. I don't know if anybody's been through this, but it's a bloody nightmare. I imagine that many people in our audience will, as I say, will have similar things. But before we get into the weeds of that, can you first give us a bit of background as to why we ought to take this seriously? And in a way, it hardly needs going over again and again, but It was a surprise to me to learn when I first looked into the subject, quite a long time ago now, that the incidence of the disabilities can run as high as 20% in some populations. That was a statistic given by Jacob Nielsen, the usability expert. I don't know whether you think that's an accurate statistic or if it maybe has changed, but can you give us a definition of disability, perhaps? The sort of differences it covers and the challenges that this can present to people in work situations, particularly.
Okay, so there's quite a lot to unpack
there.
Yeah,
several questions. So I can go off and make a cup of tea while you answer them.
Yeah. I'll start off probably just, I think you said, why is it important? So I think for me, there's so many reasons why it's important, but a real fundamental reason that I think accessibility is important is because this idea of accessibility being a right rather than a privilege. So I think a lot of people, as you say, however we come across accessibility, whether it's because we have personal experience or because we know someone with a disability or an access need, or as you said in your case, John, if someone comes to you and says, actually, I can't access your material for whatever reason, then I think for me, the kind of underpinning behind, underpinning everything really is the fact that we do have responsibility to make sure that our digital content and all the content that we create is accessible for everybody, so that everybody has an equal opportunity to access that content. And as I say, whether you become aware of accessibility, for whatever reason, I think that underpinning kind of fundamental, it's the right thing to do. It's showing digital respect, allowing everybody to be able to have an equal sort of playing field, for me is a real fundamental. So there's loads of reasons why accessibility is important, but for me, I suppose that's one reason that kind of underpins everything for me, and come, that I always come back to.
Yeah, and it shouldn't have to happen as it did with me. After the process of you built the website and you suddenly realise it's not accessible, should be in there right from the thinking, right?
In an ideal world, obviously, yeah. And also, I think if it is, then I think the type of issues that you describe of having to kind of deal with sort of retrofitting accessibility, that's where I think sometimes, obviously, if you're trying to retrofit, you have, it's a much more difficult experience. It takes much more resources to kind of, whereas if you think of accessibility up front for all of your digital content, including your learning, then accessibility just becomes part of the workflow. It becomes, just the standard, just the default of everything that you do. Then obviously it isn't so much of a kind of an issue when you come to, if there are any problems, then it's less than if you had no thoughts about accessibility at all.
I can certainly echo that with my PDF experience, because we discovered after the fact it wasn't accessible. I didn't realise that it was such a difficult medium to make accessible. And what ended up happening is that we had to go right back to the beginning and reformat the it's a 60-page magazine on PDF format. So we had to go right back to the beginning and set the thing up properly so it worked. So that's a really kind of, a real lesson. Can we talk a bit about the incidence of disability in the workplace?
So I think coming back to your question, part of your question as well was about the statistics. So I think the statistics is a really interesting point. I think it's quite difficult when and you'll probably find if you do some research into statistics around disability, they can vary considerably, particularly if you're looking kind of at global disability statistics. And that's really often because of the way both that disability is defined in different countries, the way that, statistics are gathered, etc. So it can really vary. I think the 20%, I think is particularly in the UK, as I think is considered to be the kind of like a really good kind of estimate of what the kind of levels of accessibility are. I think I tend to stick to disability or accessibility experts, hassle inclusion. They say in most Western countries it's between 12 and 26% of the population. So I think that's for me kind of like a really good gauge. As I say, it really varies from country to country depending on how those statistics are gathered. Another really good statistic I think to be aware of is that if you consider that's kind of like that's their what they suggest is in Western countries, but globally, I think a really good estimate is about 15% of the population. So I think it, rather than sort of going into depth about exactly how the statistics are gathered, I think that's a really good a good sort of starting point to be aware of how many people are affected. And I think when it comes down to, if we switch a little bit more into learning, one of the kind of myths and the misconceptions I think around accessibility and how important it is how people are very unaware of disability in the workplace. So I think really difficult to gather statistics, but I think if I'm right in saying, I have to check on my notes here, but I think that in 2020 a labour force survey said that 4.4 million disabled people are in work in the UK, so that's 13.5%, I think. So again, for me, that's a really significant statistic to be aware of, because a lot of time people aren't aware that there is disability in their workplace, because a lot of disability, a lot of access needs are hidden. So again, another statistic, an organisation, Purple Tuesday, have come up with the statistic that about 80% of disability is hidden. So for me, that really explains why you do have quite a misconception of people thinking, well, why do we need to make our workplace learning accessible, because there is so little, we don't have it in our organisers, we don't have it in our department, we don't have it, in our team, for example. So I think that's a real key one as well.
But if you're including things like colour blindness and
Definitely.
dyslexia, those are, I think for colour blindness, it's like 10% or something. Dyslexia, very high. In e-learning agencies, you tend to find that a lot of the graphic designers have a dyslexic, and
also colourblind. Yes, I'm married to a colourblind graphic designer, so that's very prevalent.
Yeah, and I think if you have those things in your family, my father was colourblind. It was an issue when he tried to become a pilot because he couldn't tell red from green, so he didn't know if the planes were coming towards him or, for the tail lights, red and green left and right. Couldn't tell whether the plane was coming towards him or going away from him, so he never quite made it as a pilot. And my brother was dyslexic and still is dyslexic. So that does cover quite a lot of people. I suppose it comes more to you if you have that in your family, but...
Yeah, I think it's one in 12 men, I think, are colourblind, as far as I remember. Yeah, so it is really a high statistic.
Yeah, and there is a taxonomy, isn't there? To do with kind of like sensory disabilities, psychomotor. Help me out here.
So again, it's coming back to answering your question, I suppose, about the definition of disability that you were saying. How are we going on these statistics? So I think that's also, before we kind of break it down into kind of different access needs, I think it's also just worth being aware of some of the definitions of disability. Okay. So quite a common one from the UK Equality Act, I think is a really useful one to start off with, and that really looks at it from really the medical sort of model of disability, which really focuses on kind of physical and health perspectives. And again, if I just read that to you, what that definition of disability says is, it says you're disabled if you have a physical or a mental impairment which has a substantial and a long-term adverse effect on your ability to carry out day-to-day activities. So that's the kind of legal definition from the UK Equality Act. I think a lot of people now think that thinking of more of a social model of disability, which focuses a little bit more on external barriers. So rather than seeing disability just as I say, in this medical model where it's a physical or a health condition, basically, the social model of disability really looks at the fact that everybody has abilities and everybody has access needs, but we can provide an equal playing field as long as we break down the barriers. barriers. So the idea, I think, that of external barriers such as it could be in your environment is something that actually disables people rather than the condition itself, is a really important kind of a different way of looking at disability. So again, if I give you another definition, this one comes from the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and what this one says is that persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. And for me, that's a much better definition of disability, because it really, as I say, focuses on that social model, which looks at, as I say, everybody having abilities, everybody having access needs, but there are things that we can all do as a society to make sure that we enable people who have different conditions to actually, as I say, participate equally in society. So I think for me that's a really important distinction between the kind of two ways of looking at disability. And then moving on to your other question,
right.
it's actually if we're kind of breaking it down and we're looking at different types of access needs. So I think again a lot of people, a lot of misconceptions around accessibility are that we focus specifically on. Quite a lot we focus on vision. So a lot of people are aware of people with access needs, and they think of sort of immediately they think of someone who might have be blind or have low vision and maybe a screen reader user. So a lot of the kind of like I would say, automatically people tend to think of access needs in terms of a vision access need. So obviously that's an important category. What we tend to do from when we're kind of trying to get to grips with accessibility and applying it to any digital content, whether that's day-to-day documents, PowerPoint presentations, learning, whatever, is to try and break it down into these kind of four fairly neat categories. So as I say, vision is one of those. Within that vision category, as well as having people who might be blind or have low vision, you could also, as you say, have people who are colourblind as well. So that's another important factor to be aware of when you're thinking about vision. We then quite often have the next category that we tend to is another sensory one, so it tends to be hearing. So obviously, people who are deaf or are hard of hearing, and all the different conditions that can lead to having that kind of access need. And then motor access need is one that a lot of people probably are not quite so aware of or might overlook. So from a motor access need, from the digital perspective, the digital point of view, it's really important to be aware that it's the type of it's an access need which affects people's ability to interact with hardware. So for example, someone who wouldn't necessarily be able to use a mouse to be accessing or navigating or entering content digitally, but there are lots of assistive technologies that people can use. And equally, if someone's using a mobile device, not everybody is able to activate that device using, tapping or using their fingers. But there's a huge amount of assistive technology, keyboard access, speech recognition, and also eye tracking software, for example, which allows people to interact with digital content, but just in a different way. So not using, the traditional mouse or using hands and fingers to be accessing mobile devices, for example. And then the final category from the point of view of digital content is generally is cognitive access needs, and that's probably the widest, I would say, category, which has a kind of the most different types of kind of conditions. So they can vary from things like learning disabilities such as Down syndrome, and then some of the conditions we were talking about, the kind of neurodiversity, so things like the dyslexia, ADHD, autistic spectrum, etc., those types of conditions. And then there's also within that group you have kind of people with mental health issues as well that can also affect cognitive ability. So although there's kind of lots of labels, lots of definitions, those I think are the four kind of main categories to be aware of when we're thinking about having wanting to accommodate people who have different access needs. And in addition to that, you also have, although it doesn't affect learning quite so much, but you also have people who have speech access needs as well, who might not be non-verbal, or may have some issue with their speech as well. So that can obviously, particularly when you're thinking of maybe live learning sessions, that can be more of an issue as well. So that's really kind of a broad overview. So hopefully that answers the question.
Broad, fairly thorough. Accessibility is an issue that affects a huge range of businesses, from websites to architects, food outlets and beyond. But your focus area is accessibility for e-learning. I think that's what you've done a lot of in your career. What sorts of particular issues and challenges does learning present? I mean, obviously a lot with e-learning, a lot of it's on screen. But is there something particular about learning that comes up with regards to accessibility?
So I think probably what springs to mind really is yes, there are particular issues, but I think for me the reason why learning is so important is because it has such a profound impact on people. So for me, that obviously websites, there's a lot of websites which provide essential services, that are absolutely vital for people to be able to access. But for me, when you're thinking of someone's ability to learn, it's someone's it's coming back to someone who has basically equal participation, equal and effective participation in society. So whether that starts in from a school environment, higher education, further education, a lot of what we do is workplace-based learning. It's, for me, a fundamental right that everybody has equal access to learn and achieve their potential. So I think part of the issue, I suppose, is kind of the responsibility we have, I feel, as learning designers and developers, to make sure that the learning that we're creating, that we are very often very passionate about, and we want to make it engaging, we want to make it a great learner experience. So for me, there's as I say, the primary thing is like having the responsibility to make sure that we are giving everyone equal access to this learning. So it's kind of again, one of those kind of overarching principles that I always come back to. It's kind of thinking, this isn't just, this is my job, which I'm very passionate about. I want to make this a great learning experience. I don't want to do that and exclude 12 to 26% of my audience because I'm not aware of accessibility. It very often is a question of not being aware, rather than people deliberately, as we were discussing at the beginning, people aren't deliberately creating barriers to exclude people, but it's just this lack of awareness that can lead to kind of me deciding whether someone is able to do their job, and for me that's not a position that I want to be in. I want everybody to have equal access. So I think that's the first point that I'd make. I think if we kind of compare creating learning to some of the other industries that you were talking about, particularly web development, I think one of the key things for what we do is probably coming back to this idea of making things engaging and interactive. Is what we're doing is different to, in some ways it's very different to someone who's creating maybe an informational website or an e-commerce site, for example. We are creating a piece of learning. We want that learning to be, as I say, engaging and interactive and effective to help someone reach the goal of whatever it is that we're trying to learn. So I think a key, not just kind of doing a tick box exercise in saying, well, yes, I've made sure it's reached all of the guidelines it needs to, but actually to make it a good piece of learning and an accessible piece of learning is a particular challenge that we have. And again, I think we do have a kind of a myth or a kind of an assumption or a misconception that learning that is accessible cannot be interactive, it cannot be engaging. We still have this kind of mindset that as soon as we introduce accessibility, then we're immediately stripping out anything that's engaging, anything that's interactive, any visual content, because we can't have visual content if we've got someone who's a screen reader. It's that kind of, it's that really to upfront having to probably address that that kind of misconception, those assumptions that we have about accessibility, and making sure that we can create learning that is, as I say, both accessible and a great piece of learning. So that's I see one clear distinction between what we do and maybe other industries or other approaches to accessibility. And you see that a lot when you actually look at the kind of standards or the guidelines around accessibility, because the best practice guidelines globally are considered to be the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And that is exactly the issue that a lot of people have is they realise, they get pointed in the direction of these guidelines, but those guidelines are written for people who were originally written for people and still have the focus of people who are doing web development, and very often people who are typically have a coding background, and so understand HTML coding, understand CSS and the YARIA coding, which is for accessibility. But a lot of people who are creating learning are using authoring tools, which you don't necessarily need to have that level of knowledge for. And in actual fact, I think a lot of web developers now are also using, content management systems that you don't necessarily have to have that knowledge. But if you look at the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, they're very much written in a very technical language and written for people who are creating websites. So the learning, they're still relevant, but it's sometimes thinking, oh, well, how does that apply to my situation? How does that apply to my learning content? So a good example for me is maybe the looking at the standards around making mistakes, error correction, and there's quite a few in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but they are written for people who are creating web forms. So a lot of the guidelines is around, well, if you've made an error on a web form, these are the guidelines of how to avoid the error, what you do if you have an error. Obviously, that isn't something that we would be doing, but the errors that we create in learning, the errors that our learners make, are errors such as they're getting a question wrong. And how do we do that? How do we make that accessible? And it's the real interpretation of the guideline, because the guideline isn't written for that particular scenario. So hopefully that's a good example of how it can differ.
Yes, of course, making mistakes is an important part of learning, isn't it?
Definitely, absolutely.
In a way that isn't perhaps in e-commerce. If you buy the wrong flavour pizza, isn't necessarily it's a learning experience.
Definitely,
pay a bit more attention. So.
Yeah.
In the struggle against the forgetting curve that learning people are engaged in every day, there are no magic formulas, but there is science. For well over a century, psychologists have known that the spacing effect unlocks deep learning and helps learners power through to peak performance. And yet who uses it, despite the fact that modern learning systems like LXPs make it almost easy? I've written a white paper with Learning Pool that shows how you can use the spacing effect to beat the forgetting curve. Download it now. Meet the evolving nature of work with Cornerstone Explore, a holistic people growth experience that delivers a fully integrated, personalised journey of learning, skill development and career mobility for every person. I'd share all the ways Cornerstone Explore is designed and personalised for the ways your people want to grow and work, but this is only a 30-second ad. To learn how you can unite people growth with business success, visit csod.info/future-ready. You've developed your practice in an era when the content types in learning, and especially e-learning, were fairly narrow, i.e. mainly modules of self-paced instruction. If we go back to the kind of, the noughties for about 10 years, that was the, and still is quite dominant. But that scope has now widened considerably. There's lots of online videos, particularly the last few years, user-generated content now. We have curation of general web resources. We have performance support systems coming along as well. We have mobile delivery has been a big thing for accessibility, and increasingly now virtual reality and AR. I'm conscious of kind of shoehorning several questions in here.
I was going to say,
the general point is here.
That one again.
Having gone from something which is really quite limited in scope, suddenly we've had this explosion and a proliferation of learning media. How are the accessibility guidelines keeping up with that, and what are the chances adding another question on the back of that, I'll be able to go home now. What are the chances that the metaverse is going to be accessible?
Ah, it's a good question. Okay, so I think I'm kind of unpacking that. I think that for a lot of the content, for a lot of digital content, the guidelines, the standards around accessibility are, relevant across the board. So, for example, whether a lot of the e-learning content now does have video in it. However that video is presented. And there are some really helpful guidelines around how to make that accessible. So things like making sure that you've got captions, that you have transcripts, that you have audio description, and obviously that is relevant across the board. However, wherever your video is appearing in whatever format. I think there's another part of that question to unpack really, which comes to the kind of the systems that we're using. So whether that is the authoring tool that we're using to create content, or whether it is the LMS, or whether it is, wherever that's held, there is a whole big question around the accessibility of the tools that we're using. And I have seen quite a lot of progress in the last couple of years when it comes to authoring tools. The typical authoring tools that we use to create learning content, to make them more accessible. I've seen that there has been a real shift, I think, in perception that this is no longer a nice to have. This isn't something that, we only have to worry about that if it's the public sector, or if it's the federal, if it's Section 508 in the States, for example. It's obviously in the UK, we've got the public sector bodies accessibility regulations, which, obviously mean that is, a fundamental legal requirement. But I see it now from the authoring tool providers is that it is now, as I say, not just a nice to have, it is absolutely an essential requirement. And they obviously realise as well, and I see that as a real shift, that this is a business opportunity, that accessibility is an opportunity. It's still, because it still isn't mainstream, it isn't where we want it to be, it isn't the default, it is still really a unique selling point. If you've got an authoring tool that is accessible, then you have got an edge over your competitor when theirs is not accessible. But it isn't something that I see. There are some key players, particularly in kind of like the kind of the learning management type of LMS type thing. There are some key ones which are accessible, but it's that kind of a lot of technology kind of sort of maybe which doesn't seem to be so much of a focus. So there still seems to be a lot of technology out there which has been created without having accessibility in mind. And then if accessibility then is considered, then again, unfortunately, we're in a situation of kind of shoehorning it in at the end, and it not being a smooth process, not being part of the workflow, for example. So I think there's a lot of technology that's still in our industry that still isn't as accessible as it needs to be. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or.
Well, obviously, with the growth of user-generated media, it's really important that stuff is accessible, because the whole point about USG is really to kind of widen the access. Everyone becomes a publisher, and it's something we accept now in the Web 2 world. Is that we don't have gatekeepers to production. So, lack of accessibility puts a gatekeeper in there that needn't be there. And you can no longer assume that everybody who creates a website is a 20-something developer and, with 2020 vision and all the rest of it, which was the case anyway. So, I'd agree with that. Moving into the kind of 3D virtual reality, AR, mixed reality side of things, what are the issues there? I mean, for me, the feeling I get with this is that everyone kind of surges forward into a new content area and create loads of stuff. And then, maybe a year, there's a lag, and suddenly there's an, oh shit moment. None of this is accessible. Oh, we didn't think of that. And then the kind of guidelines have to come in. And is that the way it works? And how's that doing in AR?
Yeah, so I think from the kind of the guidelines point of view, the guidelines have been around for a long time. I think embedded in that question that you asked me, I think, was how are the guidelines keeping up with technology? So they are I mean, obviously, it's such a long process to introduce guidelines. The version at the moment of the standards, the Web Content Accessibility Guideline, is version 2.1, and I think they came in 2018, if I remember rightly. And I think they have about 12 new standards which came in, on top of the ones from the 2.0, and they were very much came in as a result of changes in technology, so mobile technology. So one of the advantages of those standards, is that they are trying to keep up with technology. Moving forward, there's a big project at the moment which is kind of completely kind of revamping them, and that's moving away from calling them the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and they now call them the W3C Accessibility Guidelines, because they just want to move away from the fact that it's just all web content. So obviously when we're considering things such as, as you say, virtual reality, VR, AR, etc., and your question about the metaverse, the standards are kind of doing their best to keep up with that. Obviously, as I say, because they are, to get through the process of introducing a new standard, there is a very complex process. It isn't always as quick as we would like it to be, and it doesn't always keep up, as we would hope with technology. But the principle is there, that it is trying to make sure that those guidelines do accommodate everything. So the guidelines are there up to a point, being improved on all of the time. I think, again, coming back to kind of some of our assumptions about learning and our assumptions about things like AR, VR, gaming, etc., it surprises me how, as an industry, we still have perceptions that, it's not possible to make these things accessible. How can we possibly think about accessibility? How can you make AR and VR accessible? But if you look at things like the gaming industry, for example, they are, have come up with the most incredible technology to make things like gaming accessible. So, and I think if we kind of look beyond our, we tend to still be having discussions about making drag and drop accessible, and we're kind of thinking about other industries and how far they are from an accessibility point of view. For me, that's one of the areas where I kind of, there's a sort of a gap between the accessibility community and the learning and development community, which I think if we could bridge that gap and we could learn from other industries and learn from the technology, again, because those industries realize that it's good for business. It's not only is it beneficial to everyone, but actually it is good for their business. So if we can harness some of the technology from other sectors and put them into learning content, we've just got such a huge potential to improve the accessibility and to move on from just thinking, oh goodness, we can't, AR VR can't be accessible. So I think, again, it's for me, it's a bit of a shift in mindset. So I think when you were looking, when you specifically asked about the metaverse, I was thinking about some examples about the type of things that that you can make accessible. So, for example, you can have a sighted person can choose to have their metaverse glasses to display their path, for example. But, for example, a blind person could choose to have what we call haptic signals, so things like vibration, etc. And they could then have, or they can have, sound that's showing them the path. Equally, in gamification, quite often you do have a colorblind mode settings. So there's so much technology out there that, for me, it's almost that from the metaverse particularly point of view, because we are still kind of early on in the journey. I think we're sort of, it's an ideal opportunity to be making sure that things are accessible up front, and again, not waiting until the end and having, as you say, the shit moment when you think, oh my goodness, we've forgotten to make it accessible. I really see that there is much more interest in accessibility and it's much more mainstream than it used to be, and I'm really hopeful that not only can that come into play in an example such as the metaverse, but also what I really hope is it also then translates into learning content much more than it does at the moment. It's not separate at all. It's the same technology. It's just we need to realize how important it is to incorporate that into our learning content and into our tools.
See, I learned something there, because I didn't realise that the gaming industry had made great strides in accessibility. Also, there's a point there which had never occurred to me that I think is a really optimistic one when it comes to the metaverse. That I remember doing some work and research on haptics a while ago, and I suppose as you move into the metaverse, and you have, it's not just visual. A lot of the first version of the web is very kind of 2D, flat images and so on. As you move into virtual reality, you have haptics. You have enhanced ability to have kind of moving images, 3D images you can walk through, and all the rest of it. You're kind of hitting all the senses. So therefore, you have a wider range of alternatives and options. So you don't necessarily have to do it visually. You can do it with sound. You can do it with feel. So the ability to make this stuff more accessible actually increases with that. I think that's really fascinating, and it just hadn't occurred to me.
Yeah, I think another great example, one that I found again recently, I hadn't also thought about, was people maybe with vocal challenges as well. So again, you have the ability to have a voice changer, which may help them, in communication, and also people sometimes, for example, with maybe severe autism, who might find it easier to speak through an avatar. Those are the types of things that you are, as I say, you're not making it accessible because you've got to tick the box. You're making it a better experience you're accommodating everybody's different, abilities in their access needs, and it's just a better experience for everybody, really. So even again, coming back to this idea of verbal, even non-verbal, people can use a soundboard, for example, and that allows them to build sentences or use text to speech, for example, and that just creates that is how they can create a voice for an avatar. So again, for me, that is just as you say, it's really positive. It's not being limited by our kind of assumptions and our kind of maybe misconceptions about technology, and seeing it as a potential. And also, I think we tend to get a little bit stuck that accessibility is a limitation. So again, coming back to our industry and sometimes thinking again this idea of, well, accessibility means that we can't do all of this. Actually, accessibility being a huge innovator, because people are thinking differently, and people are considering, it's that kind of empathy, considering different in everybody's different access needs and everyone's different preferences, and just making it, as I say, a better experience for everybody.
To get kind of practical, what are your top tips for making sure that digital learning is accessible? What I'm getting so far is that it is just purely having that awareness right at the front of mind about the inclusiveness you need to have when you approach any design task. But moving on from that, what are your top tips for making sure your digital learning is accessible?
So I suppose for me, my top tip, again, really just sort of coming back to my own practice and my own experience, probably my own frustrations as well, is really trying to, I would say, kind of make accessibility accessible, because it can feel completely overwhelming when you start looking at it. And even when we break down our access needs into our 4 different categories, that's a great starting point for me, is to make it more understandable, and I can start thinking how I can achieve this. If I just think of accessibility, every single person, with every different access need, then it can seem completely overwhelming. So I think just being able to kind of break it down into sort of a manageable task it is the first thing I would say that it is really valuable. And for me, that is, however you want to do that, I found it really helpful to work with the four categories, and that's when I am making my content now, by working those 4 categories and imagining or being aware of those people with different access needs. It means that I don't forget someone. So that's a really good starting point. I think the other thing is, again, I suppose part of what I'm thinking is that we tend to very often be thinking about the standards. So the standards are very useful for us, particularly if we are the whole argument around the standards as to, should we be making everything accessible to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So we have legislation, particularly in the UK, around the public sector, which means that we should be meeting the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. That is level 2.1, and it's version 2.1, levels A and AA. So that's the kind of legal requirement if you're in the public sector body. Everybody else needs to make things accessible. There is a kind of underpinning the Equality Act is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but at the moment only in the public sector is the kind of like legal requirement really clearly stated out. However, for everybody else, that legislation which was introduced has made it clear that the benchmark to make things accessible is to meet those guidelines. So if you want to make something accessible, then those are the best practice guidelines that you need to be meeting. Again, if you're looking at and that in some ways is a great help, because you know where to go, you know where your starting point is. But again, from the kind of practicality of applying that, that means that, for example, at WCAG 2.1 A and AA, you've got 50 guidelines that you need to meet. So as I say, breaking them down into the 4 different access needs for me is a great starting point when I practically need to apply them. The reason that I wrote the book was because another thing for me is to make it make sense, is to have a contextual framework. So what we do as learning designers and developers. So what do we need to know to make something accessible when we're first setting the project up? What do we need to know when we are looking at using any images in our content? What do we need to know about text and formatting? What do we need to know about movement? How do we make movement accessible? What do we need to know about audio and video content? So for me, that I needed something to make it make sense. When you look at the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, you basically have a huge, great list, 4 great long lists under different principles, which just didn't mean anything at all for me and the role that I was doing. So that's where the kind of like trying to make it make sense started from, and thinking about how can I break this down. But I think obviously the book it has got, as I say, that framework which I use all the time and find really helpful. But if you still, if you want to just have the kind of like the very basics, I would still say start from those 4 different categories. So I can give you lots of examples of how to make your learning content accessible for those 4 categories if you'd like me to go into detail. Or
presumably they're in the book. Now, this book of which you speak, can you give us the title and maybe hold it up to the camera for the people on YouTube and tell people where they can get it?
Oh, it's upside down. Oh, back to front.
No, upside down and back to front. Yeah.
Yeah,
that's right.
Sorry.
And the title is Designing Accessible Learning Content. Available from good bookshops and bad bookshops everywhere.
Yes, across the board.
Okay, we'll put a link in show notes for that.
Okay.
There are so many other questions I could ask you, but we have to keep the podcast to a sensible length, and I'm sure people will be inspired by the passion you bring to the subject and the expert way that you explain it to go and learn more and to get your book. But for now, Susi Miller, thank you very much for appearing on the Learning Hack today.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to Susi and to our sponsors Learning Pool and Cornerstone. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
Don't miss the last episode of Great Minds on Learning Season 2 next week on the Greeks. And meanwhile on the Learning Hack, we're hoping to feature the great Guy Wallace very soon.
Stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.